Welcome, everyone, to the next episode of On Healing, Conversations on Wholeness. Today, we're joined by Darren Sudman, a visionary leader whose career spans over 2 decades in both the corporate and nonprofit sectors. Darren's journey is one of transformation, marked by his dedication to creating meaningful change through innovative partnerships and mission-driven work. Starting his career in law, Darren initially believed it was the key to building a more equitable world. But his perspective shifted during his time at America Online, where he witnessed the power of a company's assets and resources to create real impact in communities. This realization set him on a new path, one that would bridge the corporate and nonprofit worlds. A defining chapter in Darren's life came with both professional innovation and personal tragedy. While helping to launch the Advanta Bank Kiva B4B project, which encouraged small business owners to support entrepreneurs through microloans, Darren faced the unimaginable loss of his son Simon to sudden cardiac arrest. Out of his profound grief, he and his wife Phyllis founded Simon's Heart, an organization dedicated to preventing sudden cardiac arrest in young people. Under Darren's leadership, Simon's Heart has made remarkable strides, screening thousands of students, passing critical legislation, and launching initiatives like the CPR Jukebox and a digital registry for research. In 2025, Simon's Heart will celebrate 20 years of life-saving work, and Darren continues to serve on its board of directors. Today, Darren leverages his vast experience to build strategic and impactful programs for nonprofits and companies alike. His latest tool, the Mission IQ, is helping nonprofits evaluate their operations to better align with their missions. From working with organizations like the National Lacrosse League and Walter Payton's estate to developing initiatives that leave lasting impact, Darren brings both heart and strategy to every endeavor. Darren, it's an honor to have you here today. Before we dive into your remarkable journey and the lessons you've learned along the way, I always ask guests to share an intention for the conversation. So maybe we can take a few moments to think of what our intention is, what we hope that listeners and viewers may take from this conversation as it relates to healing, potentially outside the medical system, and overall resilience. So when you're ready, you can share yours.
Yeah, it's easy. We haven't hung out in a really long time, and when we did at TED Med Health, it was just a great conversation, great ideating, and I'm excited to answer some questions and share things and learn from you.
Awesome. Thanks, Darren. Yeah, so for viewers and listeners, Darren and I first met several years ago at TED Med, which TED Med I think is transformed now. I don't know if it fully exists in its current or the form that it used to exist, I should say. And I was quite taken by Darren's story, very inspired. Ended up writing a bit about Darren and Simon's Heart for Elemental, I think was the online forum, and that got a lot of attention and a lot of interest, and I always wanted to connect back with Darren, and part of his story is in the last chapter of my book, looking at the topic of letting go of grief and really alchemizing that into creating meaningful change in the world. So I know this is going to be a really inspiring chat. And my intention is that every listener and viewer will be as inspired as I was many years ago. I think it must have been 6 or 7 years ago now, and really take all of the wisdom that Darren shares today into their own lives, regardless of what they're navigating on their healing journey. So just to dive into it, so let's talk about the origins of Simon's Heart. So Simon's Heart was born out of profound personal loss, as we know. Can you share with viewers and listeners the story of its beginnings and then how your experience with grief has really shaped the mission of your work, both with Simon's Heart and then all of the other initiatives that you're doing right now?
Yeah, so as you mentioned in the introduction, Simon's Heart will be 20 years old in 2025. And that also means that Simon would be 20 years old in 2025. So this organization has plodded along his life or absence thereof. Uh, he was 3 months old. We put him down for a nap after dinner. He didn't wake up. Um, we were told by our pediatricians, we had two at the time, to go get our hearts checked because babies just don't die. The initial prognosis was SIDS, and um, unfortunately, I think that's where the story stops for a lot of families. But because of this advice we got from our curious pediatricians, my wife Phyllis was diagnosed with a heart condition called long QT syndrome, which is an arrhythmia, which means that your heart doesn't beat the way it should because there's an electrical problem. And so, with that information, we started doing research and found out that 10 to 15% of SIDS deaths were attributed to long QT syndrome. That was some research by Michael Ackerman out of the Mayo Clinic. And and so as we got answers, we kind of saw a map in front of us because we're very fortunate. We have a really nice house. We have savings. Our kids live in a great school district. Um, and at the time, I was also doing a lot of work in a part of Philly that doesn't have that kind of living. And so I saw little kids struggling there. Um, and then I saw my kid just die. And I didn't know why. Like it didn't make sense. It never makes sense. And so at the time I was like, well, what should I do? Should I try to make the lives of other people better, to give them the life that Simon can't have? Should we do something about uh, SIDS or hearts? Because what we didn't want is for another family to lose a child. And so as we learned more, as we found out it was heart related, it went away from trying to solve the mystery of SIDS to, okay, we didn't know that sudden cardiac arrest was a kid thing. We just thought it was a old person thing. And the more we learned, the more we realized that we weren't the only ignorant parents. People don't think about their kids' hearts. Uh, you can't find a couple that did more research on strollers and formula. We were ready, but we weren't. And so that's kind of how it began. That's kind of how we picked sudden cardiac arrest. And in terms of the grief, the grief was the fuel uh, to do something. Um, the grief was the loss. The grief was this can't happen again, uh, out of ignorance. If it happens by accident, fine, but not by ignorance. Parents need to know what we didn't know. Um, and and the grief gave us the idea to start an organization, which isn't for everybody because it's a ton of work, but it allowed us to pour the energy that we would have had and used to raising Simon into helping other people.
Hmm. Just sitting with that, that was such a remarkable story. And I wanted to sort of really hone in on just that idea of how, or what you just spoke about around pouring that grief and again almost alchemizing it into something that can help other parents. I think that's really powerful. And what Simon's Heart has been able to do since is absolutely remarkable. Um, as you sort of just spoke about, grief can be a complex companion. So how has it shaped your understanding of healing more generally, and what lessons has it taught you in terms of carrying those lessons forward into your work right now?
Well, I think grief is a natural occurring emotion, and and I think that every person alive at some point is going to experience it, different degrees. Uh, I learned pretty early not to compare grief. There's no misery Olympics. There's no
Hmm.
awards for that.
Hmm.
And what might agonize one person might not phase another. But we're all gonna have someone we love die, and so we all have to face it. And so I think the first thing is embracing it, acknowledging it, honoring it. You know, I never sit around if I'm with friends or watching, you know, one of those classic movies that just makes you laugh the whole time. I never sit around and go, wow, I'm happy. I'm laughing a lot. How long is this going to last? Is this going to last forever? I just go with it and I embrace it in the moment. And I think grief has to be managed the same way because we can't escape it. And I actually think it's also cleansing. It helps whatever happens in our body. It's pushing things through. It's rejecting things. It's forcing us to acknowledge things, and it'll run its cycle. I think the real harm occurs is when we lose sight of why we're grieving and we focus on the fact that we are grieving. So then it becomes, in my case, um, my son is gone. Uh, I'll never know what he's going to become. I can't believe that. It's so unfair. And then on top of that, I pile on, why do I still feel crappy? Why do I still like resent people? Why do I still not want to be around friends that are having babies or family events? Uh, and so I think it's healthier, at least it was for me, to not question the grief cycle, to not question what I was feeling, and just to have faith, um, not like a religious faith, but just a faith that this too will end.
Hmm. I think that's such an important point there around, especially around faith and the idea of it being cleansing and bringing up things that maybe need to be looked at. Can you speak a little bit more about that? Like, if you think about, you know, it was 20 years ago, but um, bring us back to, I guess, that moment of that initial shock and how it sort of how those feelings kind of transformed, and what really did feel like, what did come up for you in terms of some of those things that you were forced to look at.
Yes, I want to acknowledge that grief is a unique journey for everyone. Phyllis and I had very different journeys in those early days, and we continue to have very different journeys. I'll give you two examples.
Mm-hmm.
Um, uh, after Simon died, he was 3 months old. He died at home. Uh, we could not spend that night at home for a few years, so we left our house, and we would go away for a long weekend somewhere. We had a 2-year-old daughter at the time, who's now a senior in college, and or we would just, you know, drive 45 minutes away to stay somewhere. We didn't want to be here because it was really hard, and so there was a point about 2 years in where I was sitting on a beach, and I'd always, you know, heard from the older people in my life, and I would always brush it off because it sounded so cliche. Like, be thankful for what you have. Well, you know, when you're growing up and you don't have what your friend has, what you have isn't enough.
Mm-hmm.
But I remember just having the realization that there is so much suffering and death in this world. There are there is someone somewhere else, lots of them, who just lost a child too. And then there are lots of people who never had children. And so if I can shift my perspective from this is unfair, everybody lives till they're 80, everybody's kids graduate and get married. Um, every parent dies before their kid. If I can reject those assumptions and say, sure, I didn't get much from 3 months. I didn't ever have a conversation with Simon. We never threw a ball. We never, you know, went to see a movie because he was 3 months old. But I had that, and I can't look at the people in the eyes who don't have that and be so miserable for the rest of my life. So it really shifted that perspective, and from that day forward, it just gave me space um, to accept the situation I was in, instead of always uh, resenting the world for what it took from me.
Mm.
Um, and then I promised you another one, but it just escaped my mind. So hopefully it'll come back to me.
Yeah. No, I think that was so powerful. I think what you shared about, first of all, that grief is very different for all of us. There isn't sort of one particular process. People talk about the stages of grief. Sometimes that applies to people, sometimes it doesn't. Um, other people talk about it as sort of almost like a stop and go thing, where sometimes they feel it very intensely, other times it's not in their mind. Um, and we're always
I remember
Go ahead.
I remember the other example,
Sure.
and I think it's really important to share, because I just shared how um, awful those first few years were, um, and it's important to know from my journey that uh, my new normal. Um, people are really cautious about the words they use about life after losing someone, particularly a child, and so for me to say, my life got better, doesn't sound right. So I say that the intensity of the pain dulled, and those good things about life, the laughter, the fun, um, was present more often than it was in the beginning. And that's best illustrated by um, the fact that I forgot one year that it was the anniversary of his death. Um, every I'm Jewish, and in the Jewish religion, you honor immediate family members by lighting a candle on certain days throughout the year, particularly the anniversary of their death. And it was a ritual that we did for years and years. I don't know, maybe it was when he was 17 or 18. Um, I knew the date was coming, January 15th, when it was, January 24th. But when January 25th came around, I was like, oh my gosh, we forgot to light the candle. And my immediate thought was, should I feel guilty about this? Did I let him down? But then I went to the thought that no, like that just means that you're healing. And look, I don't need to light a candle on a specific day for me to know what he meant to us. Um, because we think about him all the other days, and he's certainly present in the work that we do with Simon's Heart. So I just looked at that as a real positive, that I can let go of some of these things that society makes us focus on, like anniversaries, um, and just be closer to a new normal.
Mm. And this point about sort of this new normal, I think, is really interesting because so Elizabeth Lesser, in her book Broken Open, which is an excellent book, she talks about this idea of there is sort of the time before and the time after, and she calls it the phoenix moment. So before tragedy strikes, and it could be death, it could be losing a job, it could be a new diagnosis, it could be a natural disaster, all a number of different things. Um, that our identity shifts so much that we are effectively broken open, and there is a very distinct line in the sand of in this case sort of the Darren before and then the Darren after. Do you relate to that idea?
Oh, definitely. It's and that's really hard for people to grasp. I'm convinced that whoever created us uh, gave us a real good feature in that you cannot imagine what it feels like to lose a child until you lose a child, uh, even if it happens to someone who's just really close to you. And that's a good thing, because if we were able to just kind of cue that up, and feel that at any time, we would never leave our houses, and we would lock our children away. So I agree with that, and it's no different than if you go away for a week vacation. That's just amazing, or you go to university, or you go on a trip. Every new experience that we have creates a different version of ourselves. We can't always unsee and unhear things that we experience, and so something as traumatic as this really reshapes you.
Mm. And there's this idea of post-traumatic growth. So this, very unique growth process that happens after a traumatic event like this. From what I understand, that is sort of what helped shape this foundation and this organization, Simon's Heart. Can you maybe share a little bit about that process of alchemizing it, and maybe first start with a really interesting story that you shared with me, which I talk about in that article, um, where at some point you were looking at sort of your daughter, for example, and you realized that you had to be strong for her, and how that sort of shaped kind of your step by step sort of process to transform this and then create Simon's Heart. So maybe talk about that process a little bit, and then what got you and Phyllis interested in creating a foundation to help other parents, or an organization to help other parents.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that we had a 2-year-old daughter when Simon passed away uh, was a godsend because it we had no other path forward than to get out of bed and make sure that she was fed and make sure she, you know, went to daycare or whatever she was doing at the time, and to make sure that her needs were met. Who knows where we would have been if that wasn't the case. So that was a blessing, and I always acknowledge that. It's really hard when you endure a tragedy to think that anything's a blessing, to think that you know you are just walking around. You've already, I don't know what the percentages are, but let's just say you're like the 1% who loses kids. So you automatically go, okay, well, what's going to happen next to me? I've already been identified as a 1%er, and so there's got to be another 1% club that I'm about to get signed up for. Uh, but I kind of, I don't know. I don't know if it was my parents or just nature that designed me, but I just didn't subscribe to that. So I acknowledge that Sally was a blessing, and the post growth I can talk to very well because there have been so many amazing people that I have worked alongside and befriended only because Simon died. And I'm never going to sit here and say, "Hey, I'm glad my kid died," but I'm also never going to say I didn't. My life wasn't enriched because of the people that I've met and befriended and collaborated with. So again, it's there are blessings. I lost a huge blessing when Simon died. I've gained so many blessings since he's passed.
Mm. So you mentioned a little bit earlier that, and we sort of started talking about this, but just looping back to it, that grief is very cleansing, and it really forces us to look at elements of our lives, or elements of our own narratives, or things that need to heal, or be looked at closely. Was there anything specific, maybe conditioning or stories or narratives that you have had held with, like, for a very long time, that you basically revisited as a result of this grieving process?
So things that help bolster me throughout the process.
Well, I think more so that, you sort of alluded to this idea that grief and many other sort of sentiments that are related to something traumatic that might happen to us force us to look at something internal, with maybe a closer magnifying glass. So it could be a narrative that we told ourselves. It could be a sense of purpose. Any of those sort of elements. What came up for you, I think, in that sort of cleansing process that grief had for you?
Really the realization that I can get through this, and be a really good version of myself. That this wasn't going to define me. It was going to. identify me. I mean, we have forever been the family in the community that lost a kid, the family in the neighborhood that lost a kid. Although, um, in a strange way, in our neighborhood of 80 houses, I think four of us have lost kids for very different reasons. But that's, you know, I think it's no different than why I didn't get a job or why the girl didn't go to the dance with me. Like, there's a million screenplays in my head that I can play. Usually, none of them are true, and that's the same battle that occurs after Simon died. It was all these things that I was going to now have to be, all the ways that people were going to definitely treat me, um, and very few of them came true. I mean, it is true that someone just said to me, um, the other night, we were having dinner with a couple that recently lost their child, said something like, when you lose a child, you lose friends and make strangers,
Hmm.
because some friends just don't know what to say or how to say it or how to be around you, and so friendships can fade. Uh, but on the other hand, like I've already shared, strangers come into your life that are just remarkable, and I think that that's kind of part of the process too. But that kind of stuff can only happen if we, as the grieving, make the decision to look up and see it. Otherwise, those things can pass us by too.
Hmm. I think that's such a unique sort of angle to this, and I want to, I guess, pull a thread there a little bit on. So it's interesting, number one, that so you're in the same neighborhood, as it sounds like, right? You've lived in the same neighborhood for the
Yep.
last 20 years. Um, do you think that you and Phyllis have become kind of I guess, the people to go to either with something like this, like grief, or you know, have you been seen, and or have you been seen, or have you walked into sort of this identity of being this wise couple that has really been through something where others in the community and neighborhood can really turn to. I'm interested to sort of hear what your thoughts are on that, and then the second is why did you decide to stay in the same community? So many people would, after something that so tragic, would have potentially wanted to escape, run away. But it sounds like you were determined to stay. And what was the reason for that?
So I've always embraced being someone who will meet with another family who loses a child, and that's because someone did that for us. And yes, it was nice. So the concept of paying it forward obviously applies, but it was so helpful because uh, you don't typically know someone who's lost a child. And one of the biggest challenges about working through a tragedy like this is realizing that you are not alone. That yes, it feels like you've been singled out for this horrible event, but you haven't. And so that was a role I was always very comfortable filling. Um, and we still do it to this day. We had dinner with a couple on Sunday. Uh, and in terms of moving, never even thought about it, which is weird because, you know, growing up, there's always the after school special with the kids in that one house at the end of the street where someone died, and the drapes are always drawn, and you come up with these ideas that it's haunted, or it just never crossed our mind. Um, and it also might be because my wife's from Philadelphia, and nobody ever leaves this town. So maybe that can't even get people to move either.
Mm-hmm. Wow. I think that's, I mean, it's remarkable that you've been able to just cultivate, this community, grow the community, and really be a resource and a beacon of light for those who have experienced the death of a child. Have you noticed that um, neighbors or community members are seeking you out for sort of wisdom and kind of other areas, and it may not be the death of a child, it could be the death of another family member, or another tragedy, in terms of just seeing you both as beacons of wisdom and resilience.
Uh, Not so much. There's plenty of people who have experienced loss,
Mm-hmm.
and as I already mentioned, we all grieve very differently. So it's really kind of limited to someone lost a child, and we know that you've unfortunately had that experience. So do you mind if I give them your number? So it's really kind of limited to that, and then also just sharing our nonprofit journey. It's been, like I said, 20 years, and we've learned a lot, and we didn't know anything in the beginning. Like we didn't Phyllis and I didn't particularly do well in math and science in school. So it's not like we were chosen because we had this, knowledge. We just figured it out. We learned what the problems were. We learned where the blind spots were. We learned from the experts what we could do about it, and then we chose very intentionally and strategically what our path would be, what we would pick up, and what we would say no to, because that's a huge part of it too, is not getting distracted or bogged down by pursuing things that maybe won't be as impactful
Mm-hmm.
in the long run.
Mm-hmm. And I definitely want to circle back to that in a second. I did want to ask you as well. So you talked about kind of the change of friendships. So we do notice this a lot with death, but also grieving other things. So it could be losing a job, it could be divorce. Where something tragic happens in our lives, and then friendships change. Especially those friendships that are built on those identities of that are very tied to the very thing that was lost. Um, so I have sort of two questions to that. So the first is, for anyone listening or watching who has a friend or family member who has experienced profound loss, such as loss of a child, what did you find, or what would you recommend they do in terms of support? Because to your point, so many people don't know what to do or say, and so they may just retreat, or so what would you recommend there? And then after that, I'd be curious to know how you navigated those shifts in friendship.
I think it's to over communicate. It's to acknowledge that me as a friend have not experienced this. I want to be here from you. I have no idea what you're feeling. I have no idea what to say. I have no idea what you want to talk about. Um, and and almost being kind of corny. Uh, I have a friend who does this, and it's amazing. He doesn't just do it with me, but that's how we met. He does it with people he doesn't even really know really well. He'll call them up, say, "Hey, I'm just checking in. I don't have anything to say." And the person might say, "Thank you, really appreciate it." The person might say, "Oh man, I'm really glad you called. This is what I'm feeling." Or, "Hey, I haven't been out of the house in 3 days. Can you go get me?" Like, he's ready to do any of those things. But just the mere fact that he's brave enough to put himself out there and say, "I'm just thinking about you." And if that's all that's said, that means a lot. The other thing too is that nobody can make you think about your kid. Like there's this really strange belief. Again, talk about the narratives that we make up in our head. Like, okay, I'm going to see Darren today, but I don't want to talk about Simon because I don't want to bring it up. Well, you know what? My son died. Odds are I'm thinking about it. You're not going to remind me, and so don't hide from it. And if you're curious about something, and I know that it's coming from a good place, ask me, um, because we as grieving people need to talk about it, need to like a big ball of clay. It needs to be kneaded and pounded and worked out. And so when there's this really awkward posturing dance happening, uh, we have to put energy into managing that or responding to that, instead of just focusing on what we all know the real challenge ahead of us is. And so I think it's just reach out, even if you have nothing, um, and and don't be afraid to say the person's name or even say, "Hey, I've been thinking a lot about Simon today. I know you are too."
Hmm. I think that's so key, and also just sort of just feeling it out in terms of what the person needs, right? I love that idea of, just saying that you're checking in. It leaves it open, um, or offering some practical help. But it can be tough. I think a lot of people struggle with, where do I start? And so they don't start at all. Um, and what you don't want is to have that person feel like they truly are alone. Give them the choice to lean into solitude, of course. Um,
Yeah, and I don't make this next comment to make anyone who's ever been in the position of a friend feel guilty, but just to kind of put things in perspective, since we've talked about perspective, is of course it's hard to reach out and have a conversation with somebody who just lost a kid or someone else dear. We're used to having conversations about the weather in our sports team. It's really freaking hard.
mhm.
But whatever hardship you're facing or challenges you're facing, obstacles you're overcoming to pick up the phone or knock on that door, it's nothing compared to the ongoing torture, that the grieving person is facing. So, like, just acknowledge it, kick it to the side, and knock on the door.
Mhm. What if you can recall, what were some things that were less helpful? Um, and of course, everyone may be different, but for you specifically, was there anything or general approaches that were less helpful during that sort of, especially during that initial period, in those initial few weeks, for example, or
I remember that group therapy wasn't particularly helpful for Phyllis and me. We met some really nice people, but for me, it isn't helpful to be with people who aren't progressing, or managing emotions in the same way I am. Well, I shouldn't say that. It doesn't have to be the same way, but it can't be polar opposites, because then it begins to have a kind of a negative impact, on how I'm processing. So we um, we went to couples therapy for a long time, to manage through this. We also consulted with a child psychologist, literally from the within the first 24 hours, because we wanted to know how we were supposed to communicate this to Sally, and and what kind of support Sally would need. So those two things were helpful. It was also real. I know the question was what wasn't helpful, but it was also really helpful for me to go to, my synagogue. In the Jewish faith, there's a period of Shiva. 7 days after someone passes away, you're supposed to stay at home, really do nothing, except sit, and people come visit you, and allow you to work through your grief. And then there's, a period of days after that, 30 days, called Shloshim, where you're supposed to kind of go to the synagogue and say a prayer. And so we spent every Friday night for the first year in services, and we're not, particularly observant, but just the act of going through and reserving time once a week to be in community and to focus on our grief and dealing with it was really helpful for me.
mm, that dovetails really nicely to this idea of faith, which is a chapter in my book specifically around the role of faith, spirituality, prayer as a healing tool. Can you speak a little bit more about that? So it may include sort of formally, going to temple or synagogue, or it may include some, a private understanding of faith and spirituality in your life. But what role did that sort of, faith play in your healing journey?
So it obviously directed the way that we were going to um, do a burial, uh, do the ceremonies afterwards, some of the rituals that we might endure, but it wasn't all positive. Uh, there's actually a, a part of Judaism that was really troubling and unsettling to us, and that was around the high holidays when there is a prayer every year. There's this concept where there's 10 days of awe from the new year, Rosh Hashanah, to Yom Kippur, the Day of Judgment. And during that time, uh, God has this book of life, and he, according to ancient texts, uh, decides who shall live and who shall die, and how it's going to happen. It's who shall live, who shall die, who by water, who by fire, who by sword, who by beast, and you go through all these things. But and I've listened to that prayer every year my entire life. I'm 54. Simon died when I was 35. So, uh, but it didn't mean anything to me. But on that 36th year, when I heard this, and when Phyllis heard it, it was like, wait a minute, you're telling me that this is how it works in our religion. And so Simon, in 3 months, did something to warrant his death. That makes no sense. And so if that doesn't make sense, then you're telling me that there's something I did since last year to warrant his death. Well, that doesn't make any sense. And so we stopped going to high holidays for years, and we would just go to the cemetery and be with him and read comforting poems and prayers and articles. Uh, but eventually we came back. We found a way to reconcile uh, the prayer, because, like, right, who really knows what the writer's intent was?
Mm-hmm.
To realize that this process of atonement is collective atonement, and so by our community actions, by the work we do together, we actually decide who lives, who dies, who thrives, who suffers,
Mm-hmm.
by what we do or do not do.
Mm-hmm.
And so whether that is true or not, that's the narrative I clung to, which got me back into um, services, or I should say, it's not like I'm beating down the door to go back, but didn't keep me away.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Were you able to lean on? So in my book, I interview a rabbi that's based in New York, Jonah Geffen, who does a lot of work um, in Manhattan and Brooklyn, and especially end of life rites. And did you find that in your sort of that specific experience, were you able to lean on a rabbi or spiritual figure to help make meaning from those texts, or did you feel like it was something that you and Phyllis had to do sort of separately?
I looked for it, and I certainly talked to rabbis that I knew, but I don't know if they're really comfortable with that prayer either, or if they really have convictions about how they've reconciled it. And so you kind of know that people are faking it.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but I'll tell you, one of the books that really helped us was Why Do Bad Things Happen to Good People by Rabbi Kushner.
Mm.
Um, Written by Rabbi Kushner, has very little to do with Judaism. So I recommend it to everybody. Um, it really made sense. And Rabbi lost a son as well. So he spoke about it from personal experience.
We'll make sure that we'll link to that and other things in the notes section. Shifting gears just a little bit now to COVID. So when we sort of reconnected for this article that I wrote, the article was more around grief in general, especially during COVID, not just grieving those that may have lost their lives due to the virus, but also our way of life. You know, it was only a few years ago, right? But the world shut down. Everything that we knew, sort of changed. How is that process for you, navigating that sudden shift and the grief of, of the old way of life, and how was that potentially, and was that different than maybe people that you knew that didn't already have profound experience with grief before COVID?
In other words, did dealing with Simon's death make it easier for me to endure COVID?
Did it prepare you in a way that, maybe many others were not prepared? And I only ask this because during COVID, when I would speak to friends and family that had had a profound experience with grief, it didn't necessarily have to be death. It could be just a similar sort of major identity shift, a major life shift. They had built a sense of resilience almost, that it wasn't that, lockdown was difficult, but their tools for navigating it seemed to be a lot different than those who hadn't. So I'm just curious about your experience, if that was true for you.
Yeah, I think there's a nuance in there too. So the answer to your question is probably. I think I don't know when things started. I don't know when I started acting or feeling specific ways in my life, but and I'm sure that Simon's death had something to do with it. But I've always kind of kept things in perspective and looked outward when something bad happens to me, whether it's not getting a job or my son dies, or whatever else that somebody else is suffering more than me. So I've always been able to kind of temper my self-pity and muster up at least the concept that I can get through this because somebody else has gotten through something worse. Um, but I also think when I lost Simon, I had to make a conscious choice, right? Because that could either give me valuable skills to deal with something like COVID, or it could make me numb and bitter that I just kind of avoid the reality of COVID. And it's just like we talked about the 1%. It's just another like 1% miserable thing that gets dumped onto my life.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's important, is that when we're faced with tragedy, we have to make tough choices as to how we're going to confront it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the choices that we make then might benefit us later in dealing with other kinds of adversity.
Mm. I think that's so wise. In the last, I guess, sort of we have about 10 more minutes left, but we spoke a little bit about faith. We spoke a little bit about, the role of therapy. What other healing techniques, outside of those two things, were helpful as part of your process of healing from this tragedy? And in my book, I define healing as really a return to wholeness. So it's not about undoing what happened. It's not about curing it or making it disappear. It's about integrating it. And sort of like Elizabeth Lesser talks about, kind of becoming that sort of phoenix that rises and is able to continue on in a stronger fashion. So what other techniques and tools were helpful for you?
Um, Definitely Simon's Heart. Definitely pouring myself into uh, work, especially work that helped other people, because it, like I said earlier, it gave us purpose. It allowed us to channel the energy we would have had to use raising him into something in his name, but more importantly, into something that could benefit other families. Uh, and uh, and the people we met along the way, and the the kids who found heart conditions um, as a result of our heart screenings. So it was definitely the work, and I don't want any listener to think that that can only come from work of a foundation that you create in memory of your child. There are so many ways to give back and make a difference, and it could be any of those. There was a quote by Barbara Bush, because they lost a child too. They lost a daughter a long time ago, and she says The death of a child is so painful, both emotionally and spiritually, that I truly wondered if my own heart and spirit would ever heal. I soon learned that I could help myself best by helping others. And that's been probably the most prolific and profound quote I've come across uh, on the subject, and it's one that my life proves out.
Hmm. I think that's really profound, and it's so clear that that you have been able to transform so much of this and use it as fuel. You know, in physics, they say that energy is neither it neither disappears or appears, right? It's just transformed, or it's neither created or destroyed. I should say it's only transformed. So it's very much like that. So maybe share a little bit about what Simon's Heart is focused on now. So it's obviously done so much, had such an impact in terms of screening. We know that so many children are walking around with undiagnosed heart conditions. It could be lung QT, it could be hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, it could be dilated cardiomyopathy. It does impact athletes even as they get older. It's interesting how some countries they do have, or some jurisdictions they do have universal screening. Many do not. It's pretty low tech. Can you share a little bit about sort of that work and where it is right now? And then I'd love to sort of hear a little bit more about some of your current advocacy efforts. Especially around, some wrongfully convicted individuals and that sort of stuff.
Yeah, so Simon's Heart is started as a heart screening organization. We continue to do heart screenings. We're still not back up to the number that we were pre-COVID, but we're doing them, and hopefully we will ramp up soon. We're in the midst of a 3 to 5 year strategic plan, but we've also evolved. We've been able to get about 17 laws passed in different states that make sure parents, student athletes, and coaches know the risks and warning signs of sudden cardiac arrest. And players are removed from play if they faint during or right after exercise, and have to be cleared by a licensed medical professional to return. We've been gathering data from our heart screenings. We probably have anywhere between 15 and 20,000 EKGs, digital versions of EKGs, as well as medical and family history on students that we de-identify data and give to qualified researchers free of charge. As you know, research happens when there's money at the end of the rainbow, and there's really not much money in device or pharma treating sudden cardiac arrest in kids. So it's hard to get research done. And so we felt that by creating a digital registry, we could help solve that problem. And then we've gotten into secondary prevention too. So primary prevention is testing, finding the conditions before they cause harm. Secondary prevention is, oh no, we have a cardiac arrest. How do we prevent sudden cardiac death? That's with CPR and automated external defibrillators. So in those areas, we created a crowdfunding website called Got AED that allows youth facilities that don't have a budget for an AED device to crowdfund, set up a campaign, raise a little bit of money, and then they receive an AED device and a cabinet. And then our version of CPR, the CPR jukebox, is an activation that we take to schools and festivals and concerts. We have a 10 by 10 inflatable and red kickballs and a playlist of over 100 songs that are between 100 and 120 beats per minute. And kids love playing and pushing on balls. One of my earliest experiences at Simon's Heart was being at a YMCA health fair, and I was at a table between McGruff the crime dog and Boy Scouts making gorp, peanuts and candy and stuff. And I would watch people go from one table to the other, walk out of their way to avoid my table, because my table had the creepy CPR dummy on it. And, they were there to have fun. And so when we started using kickballs, which simulates the same sensation of compression, kids couldn't stay away, especially boys. There's something about, recreational balls and boys, they just have to throw them and kick them. So it's been a real fun way to engage kids in a subject matter that they would usually avoid.
Right. And I mean, it's so incredible. I think the impact that you're having, and I think there's a lot more awareness. Whether it's LeBron James's son having that really unfortunate incident. Thankfully, he was seen by a medical professional afterwards. But just raising awareness of sudden cardiac death and the risk factors is incredibly crucial. And I think we're learning more even in terms of genetic risk factors and the potential for screening there too. I would love to sort of end with some of your interesting work now with advocating for the wrongfully incarcerated. Can you share a little bit more about that and how that relates to, again, sort of making meaning of your tragedy and leaving an impact on the world?
Sure, and thank you for asking. So, I mean, right now, professionally, I am working with nonprofits, helping them in a variety of ways to be more strategic or be more innovative. I'm also working with companies on corporate social responsibility initiatives. But what you mentioned was something I discovered having dinner with friends. Their daughter was in law school, and she was working with a man who had been wrongfully incarcerated at the time for 25 years. And having practiced law for 5 years a long time ago, and having a little bit of time, I said, "How can I help?" And so that turned into going to prison like once a week for a whole year, uh, sitting with Tyree, talking about law stuff some of the time, but talking about his vision for the world a lot of the times. Tyree started a couple nonprofits while he was in prison. He was always thinking about how to make that society better so that the society that he wanted to return to could be better, because every year there's hundreds of thousands of people who come home from sentences. And if they went in troubled or lost, um, and then had to endure prison where most of their time at best is unproductive, um, unfortunately, many times violent and destructive, like how can we expect a better outcome when they come back home than when they went in? It's virtually impossible. So Tyree really dedicated himself to that. And so I talked to him about that. And then I supported the legal team in ways that I could. But more importantly, I rallied our community. I had some events to raise awareness for him. I put pressure on public officials with friends through advocacy. And great news, he came home 2 weeks ago. And I've been hanging out with him uh, ever since. And I'll share with you something I just posted on LinkedIn. I took him to a conference in Philadelphia, to a really cool event called Ideas We Should Steal. Big thinkers looking around the country of things that are working in certain cities, and let's learn about them, and maybe we can do them here too. Uh, and so I was obviously inspired by all of the presentations and thought leaders. But the thing that I remember the most was at lunchtime, Tyree was eating fruit out of a fruit cup, because in prison, when I would buy him fruit out of a vending machine, we'd have to dump it out of the cup onto a paper plate. They weren't allowed to have plastic.
Oh, wow.
It had to be on a paper plate. I don't know why, but that was just a stark reminder of the little things that I don't even recognize as freedom and privilege. That, you know, 3 weeks ago, he had to dump it on a plate, and now I see him eating out of a cup. So it was very touching, and I learned so much about incarceration, about criminal justice, that it's definitely going to be a part of my focus now for quite some time.
Mhm. That's so powerful. Wow, and we're definitely gonna link. I'll definitely link to more about Tyree's story and your work in advocacy. There, I have someone on the podcast in a couple weeks, Wesley Lowery, who is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, who was part of the Washington Post team that covered Michael Brown, and so there's so much to talk about around healing our society. Right, it starts with ourselves. It starts with facing our own traumas and pain. And then how do we then sort of help shape the world and society at large, including some of these major social issues. And to one of your points earlier, once we're able to sort of take that more collective stance, I think we're so much better off for it. So thank you so much, Darren, for your time today. This was such an inspiring conversation, and it's so good to see you after so long.
Yeah, it's great to see you, and I really appreciate you have always been interested in pulling this kind of information out of people so that it can be shared with others to help make the world better. So I'm glad you haven't stopped that, and I have no expectation that you will.
Thank you so much, Darren. I really appreciate it.